Oh, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Now, this quote is probably the most known quote out of probably all of Shakespeare, not just Romeo and Juliet. So, I have Romeo and Juliet here with me, and this is just a book version. In school, we read there was this huge textbook, and it was like an actual play. But if you see, this book is formatted like a play, which is what I like about this book. And there are like footnotes and stuff, which really helps understand like the Shakespeare's like language kind of. And the thing is that most people say Shakespeare uses Old English, which is very not true, because if you search up Old English on YouTube, you wouldn't be able to read any of it, and you wouldn't be able to understand any of it. It just looks like some gibberish, probably close to German or something. So that's what Mr. Steeble, my English teacher, showed us in class, and I was really surprised, because all this time I thought Shakespeare used Old English, but then apparently not. And then, of course, if you say Romeo and Juliet, there is the prologue. And I wouldn't want to read the whole thing to you because it's fairly long, but then I'm pretty sure you would know which one it is as soon as I read it. Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. And from here, Shakespeare starts his use of poetry, because this has 14 lines, which is a sonnet, right? So, two households, both alike in dignity. So there's the Capulets and the Montagues, of course, right? So Juliet and then Romeo. But the thing is that it sounds really weird if you say like Juliet Capulet and like Romeo Montague. Like it sounds weird if you actually like put them together. But let Shakespeare do his thing. But then, so there's those two families, and then there's the prince, right? Now, I was really confused because I thought the prince was like a Capulet. But then he's neither. He's neither a Capulet or Montague. And then there's a lot of other like really, really minor characters who aren't both, like who aren't either of them. But it's mainly based on Romeo and Juliet, who are Capulet, or who are Montague and Capulet. Now the first quote I read to you, which is "O Romeo, O Romeo, O Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?" Now most people think that means like, "Oh, where are you, Romeo?" Now that is not actually what it means. It's just because of how Shakespeare kind of uses his words. It sounds like "Where are you, Romeo?" But the "wherefore" means like why rather than like where. So it means like, "Romeo, why are you a Montague?" Because right when she said this, it was the balcony scene, which was right after Romeo and Mercutio and Benvolio crashed the Capulets party. Well, technically it was just Romeo and Mercutio, because Benvolio is a part of. He was specially invited by the prince because they're fam. So I'm gonna talk about what happened at the party a little. So what happened before the party was Romeo was in love with this girl named Rosaline. And now some people say Rosaline, Rosalind, Rosaline. I just say Rosalind because that's just how I think of it. My teacher says like Rosaline or something like that. So I'm going to say Rosaline. So sorry if that's not how you pronounce it. But so Romeo was in love with Rosaline. So after that, Benvolio and Mercutio were like, "Hey, you need to get over her." Because Romeo only loved her for how she looked. He didn't actually meet her. And another thing, Rosalind doesn't actually ever come out in this play. She's just mentioned at the beginning of the play to show Romeo's transition from Rosalind to Juliet, which is pretty fast. And actually, this reminded me of a very, very famous movie, Frozen. So you know how just as Anna meets the prince, she's just like, "Oh my god, I want to marry you," right? This kind of exactly how it plays out. I'm pretty sure Frozen stole it from Romeo and Juliet. Oh, and another thing, there are a lot of like popular movies that were mainly based on really classic novels like this. For example, Batman. It was based on A Tale of Two Cities. So we watched Batman in class, and that was cool. Dark Knight Rises. I didn't actually want to watch that though. I hate Batman. Iron Man all the way. Sorry, I'm gonna get back to topic. So, Rosalind. So after that, who is it? The Capulets had a party. So, Capulet? Mr. Capulet had a party, and he's like, okay, so I'm going to invite all my family and all my friends, right? So, and of course Montagues weren't invited. But then Benvolio was invited because he is a relative of the prince, right? So when Benvolio was invited, Romeo was like, ooh, I'm gonna go too, right? But then what happened was there was a servant from the Capulets, and the servant was sent to, he had a list of people he has to invite to the Capulet party. And then when he got that list, he was like, why? Because he's a servant, and at this time, servants don't know how to read. So he has that list, but he doesn't know how to read their names. Like, of course he knows their faces. So he goes to Benvolio, and he's like, hey, can you help me? And then Benvolio sees his name on the list, and then Romeo sees Rosalind's name on the list. So Romeo's like, hey, I want to go to see Rosalind. But then Benvolio's like, it's a Capulet's party. And then Mercutio's like, let's go! Mercutio's a really, like, party guy. Like, he dies soon. Sorry. But then, before he dies, what happens is they go have fun at the party. Now, Romeo just goes for Rosalind. But then Mercutio and Benvolio are like, hey, you need to go meet some other girls and get over her because you barely know her, dude. Like, you met her, like, what, like 0 times once? So, Romeo goes first to see Rosalind. And then he looks around for her, and they all go in masks. This is a masked party, which is fairly a coincidence. But then, so he goes in mask, so no one knows it's Romeo until something happens later, which I'm going to tell you about. So Romeo goes around looking for Rosalind, right? But then he sees Juliet, and he's just like, who is Rosalind? So he switches from Rosalind to Juliet in like a millisecond as soon as he sees Juliet, just because she's pretty, once again. But then, you know, this one turns out a little bit, I want to say more successful because Romeo has a hard time with his love life and life in general. So after the party, Romeo ditches his friends to go see Juliet. Now, of course, the Capulets wouldn't let a Montague in, especially a Montague that's well known, the son of Montague, which is Romeo. So Romeo goes out to the Capulets' orchard, the backyard, and he sees Juliet. And Juliet, as soon as he walks in, she starts like talking about, oh, Romeo, like I love you, and like all that in Shakespearean language, which I don't really remember. But then Romeo hears that, and he's like, I love you too. And then from then on, they decide to get married. If only life was that easy. So after they do that, well, obviously a Capulet and a Montague is gonna be really hard to get married because their family feud has been going on for the longest time that anyone can ever remember. So of course they ask for help. Now, Romeo and Juliet aren't really close with their parents, I would say. Romeo, I don't think he ever talks to Montague in this fight because he dies. And then Juliet talks to Lady Capulet and Capulet, but then she gets hit by Capulet and she gets yelled at by Lady Capulet, and then she dies. So they don't have good relationships with their family because, of course, they're royalty, they're rich. Like, being rich doesn't always mean you have a good family. Like, usually your parents kind of ignore you, not to like offend like any of my rich friends, because they buy me food. Yeah. So, anyways, because of that, Romeo and Juliet need someone else to rely on, who's an adult, who's reliable and trustable, and someone you could really talk about your problems with. So Juliet has the nurse, and Romeo has Friar Laurence. Now, Friar Laurence isn't really any side. He's more to Montague because he is Romeo's friend. He's Romeo's friar, basically. And then, but the nurse is definitely Capulet's side. So Juliet counts more the nurse as her mother than her actual mother because her mother really just wants her to get married to Paris. Now, who is Paris? Wow, so many characters. So Paris is not a Capulet, but he is part of the royalty who is recognized and who is very noble. And any lady would want to marry him. He's good looking, he has good specs, you know, he has rich family, and he's nice too. Who wouldn't want to marry him? Except Juliet doesn't want to marry him, of course. So, like some kind of Korean drama, the Lady Capulet sets up an arranged marriage for Juliet in Paris. Now, Juliet at first, she says, okay, whatever, like, she doesn't want to marry because she's 13. I'm 14, guys. But that was how it was back then. Like, once you turned 13, you're expected to go off and live in a family, rather that is to a 60-year-old or a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old. It doesn't matter. I believe boys used to marry at like 16, which is about what Romeo was. So they were at an age to marry around that time, which is unbelievable here. Maybe in Afghanistan, it's kind of believable. Sorry. That's kind of mean. But then, so Juliet's like, okay, I'll do it, but then that was before she was falling in love with Romeo. So as soon as she fell in love with Romeo and Lady Capulet asked her again, she's like, no way, I'm not doing this marriage. And then there's this one scene where Capulet comes in and he like beats her up. And then, because she says she doesn't want to marry Paris. And he says to Juliet, if you're not going to marry Paris, I will disown you. You're not part of this family anymore. So Juliet doesn't know what to do. She's in love with Romeo, but she has to marry Paris if she doesn't want to get disowned. And, you know, she's stuck. And then comes Friar. So there is a common question that everyone asks about this play Romeo and Juliet, which is, who's to blame for their deaths? And mostly people would say Friar, because he does a lot of stupid things. Not necessarily stupid, but more like naive things. And that eventually, I would say, leads to Romeo and Juliet's death. I'm going to talk about all of his problems later. But then, this time I'm going to shift to Romeo. So after he transitioned from Rosalind to Juliet, he's like, okay, I want to marry her now. So that's the day after the party. And now, just for like FYI, all of this happens in a week. They fall in love in a week, they get married in a week, they die in a week, they build golden statues in a week. You know, it's a play, it's fictional. But then, Romeo goes to Friar, and he's like, hey Friar, can you marry me and Juliet? And of course Friar's like, are you crazy? It's been like 5 hours since, 5 hours ago, you've been like, Rosalind, like, please love me, Rosalind. And now he's like, okay, Juliet now. Yay, who's Rosalind? Forgot about her. So Friar's worried that Romeo's gonna do the same thing with Juliet, and he's worried that he's of course worried because Juliet is a Capulet. But then he realizes, he's like, wait, if a Montague and a Capulet get married, doesn't that mean the end of the feud? So that's what he wants. All Friar wants is Romeo's happiness and then the end of the family feud. So because of that, Friar's like, okay, I'll marry you with the hope that this will end the feud. Now Romeo doesn't care about the feud, like, they're in love, like, they're starstruck lovers. No one cares about like what's happening with your family. So after they get married, a lot of more things happen. So what happens is, first I'm gonna mention Mercutio's death, and then I'm going to mention a lot of other people's death. So what happens is, after Romeo and Juliet get married, Romeo goes down to the quad, and then he sees his fellow Montagues, right? And then Tybalt sees him, and he starts to start a fight with Romeo, just because he's Tybalt. And but Romeo is like, hey, you're Juliet's cousin, and Juliet is my wife now, which means you're my family. I'm not going to hurt my family. I'm not going to fight with my family. Tybalt, on the other hand, doesn't know. No one knows that they're married except for the friar, the nurse, Juliet, and Romeo. So Tybalt doesn't know anything. Even if he knew, he would probably still want to kill Romeo. They get in a fight. But first, it wasn't Tybalt and Romeo's fight. It was Tybalt and Mercutio's fight. So Mercutio, how I told you, is really playful. He's like a guy. So he loves fighting. He loves making jokes. So when he sees Tybalt and Tybalt sees him, they're kind of like really similar personalities, so Mercutio and Tybalt get in a fight. So what happens is Romeo's like, hey, stop fighting, okay, stop. But then, of course, Tybalt kills Mercutio, and then they don't realize that Mercutio is dead until probably like 5 minutes after his death, when Tybalt has already run away. And then Mercutio just like dies, and the Romeo's like, oh my god, what happened? So he goes to find Tybalt, and then he kills him. So now what happens is, so both sides are dead, right? But the prince is like, okay, so Tybalt killed Mercutio, but Romeo killed Tybalt. Therefore, Romeo should not have a death penalty, but rather he'll be banished. So Romeo gets banished. Now, what's the problem with that? Juliet's getting married in 3 days with Paris, and she's already married to Romeo. And now Juliet doesn't know about any of this news. And it gets really complicated from here, but then after Romeo leaves, he is sent away from Verona. And then when he's banished, he goes to Friar, and he's like, oh my god, what am I gonna do? I can't see Juliet anymore, I can't see my family anymore, I'm like, I don't know what to do, I'm just gonna kill myself. And then right then, Nurse walks in, and he's like, no, you're not gonna kill yourself. Because I am like the mother to Juliet, and if that happens, Juliet is gonna kill herself too, which is exactly what happens. So, after all of that drama passes, I'm just gonna get to the very, very end, when the most important characters die. And now, I think this is the first book I read where the main characters die. Maybe not first, probably second or third, but it's very rare that the main characters die. Because, it always has to be a happy ending, Well, I would say kind of it's a happy ending for the family feud itself. So what happens is that Juliet goes to the friar because Capulet says, you're gonna marry Paris, okay? And then Juliet doesn't know what to do, so she goes to Friar and she asks him for help. She's like, what should I do? And Friar's like, okay, I'll give you this. I'm gonna tell you what this is later. I'll give you this. Now, just drink this, okay? Just drink this and just trust me and say that you're gonna marry Paris. And then drink this the night before your marriage. So Juliet's like, okay. And now, what is that? That is, it's like a sort of a drug vial. And if Juliet drinks it or stabs herself with it, then she's basically dead for 42 hours. So she's not actually dead, but it's kind of like it looks like she's dead. So the friar's plan was to make everyone think that Juliet is dead, and then the Capulets would put Juliet in the family tomb. And then he will send a letter to Romeo saying that Juliet has faked her death, now you can go run off with her. And then all of this messes up when he trusts the letter to Romeo with Friar John. So who is Friar John? He's not really important, except he kind of causes both of their deaths. So what happens is that during this time there was a lot of disease, a lot of really tension, not just between the fake Capulets and Montagues, but just overall Italy, overall Europe. So, and another thing, and one thing that was really, really, the tension was really building and causing a lot of misunderstandings was the plague. So, what happened was Friar John wanted to go deliver the letter to Romeo, like Friar Laurence said. But then the security guard stopped and they're like, hey, I think you have the plague, I don't think you're allowed to go out. Because everyone who had the plague wasn't allowed to leave their city or come in another city, because if you got sick from your own city, then your city can die, don't disturb my city. And that was just how it was. So Friar John couldn't deliver the letter to Romeo, and so Romeo doesn't know how Juliet is doing, and Juliet knows that Romeo is banished, and she thinks that when she wakes up she's gonna find Romeo next to her. Well, basically she does, but except he's dead. Now, what happens after that is that Romeo comes with his servant, Balthazar. And then Balthazar says, Juliet is dead. So Romeo rushes back to Verona, and right there he sees Paris. Now Paris, of course, he's in love with Juliet, even though Juliet is not. And this is when Juliet is dead in her tomb. So Paris goes to visit her with flowers, and then he's like crying and sobbing, right? And then Romeo comes, and then Paris is like, I'm gonna arrest you. You're banished from Verona, and you're back here, so I should arrest you. You have violated the laws. You have violated my city. So, but then Romeo's like, hey, I don't want to start a fight with you. You know, can I just go on my own peacefully and just see Juliet at least? And then he's like, nope, you're getting arrested. So they have a fight, and then eventually Romeo kills Paris. And then Paris asks to be laid next to Juliet in her tomb because he thinks that she's actually dead, and so does Romeo. So Romeo's like, okay, I killed you, so I'm just gonna let you die wherever you want to die. So he drags Paris into Juliet's tomb. And then now the problem starts from here. Now Romeo sees Juliet, who's not fake dead, who's like real dead. Well, at least what he thinks. So Romeo's like, what is happening here? So he goes to a merchant, and now merchants are really poor and they're really desperate for money. So he says, okay, give me poison and I'll give you as much money as you want. And the merchant was like, okay. So Romeo has poison, and he also has a dagger with him, just because he's every person in the city has some kind of weapon just in case, especially because of the feud. So he has a dagger with him and he has poison with him. And then he sees Juliet dead and he's like, I can't stand this. So he drinks the poison and he dies. And then Juliet wakes up a short while later, and Juliet finds Romeo dead, actually dead. And then she's like, oh my god, what is happening? Why is he dead? Doesn't he know that I'm not actually dead? So this is kind of funny actually. But then, so Juliet's like, okay, I can't live in a world without him. I can't marry Paris anyways because he's dead. And my father's probably gonna make me marry this other random creep, maybe some 60-year-old, who knows? And she's like, I can't live without Romeo. So she finds Romeo's dagger and stabs herself. So after that, the watchmen gather everyone who is in the surrounding of the Capulet family tomb. And that was Friar Laurence and Balthazar. And then, so Balthazar doesn't really have a lot to say because he's just Romeo's servant. But on the other hand, Friar has a lot to say. And what he does is he explains everything that happened from when Romeo and Juliet met at the Capulet party to when they got married, to when he got the poison, when he, all of this, and then he tells that to the prince. And Prince calls Capulet and Montague, the heads of each feud, and then he says, okay, what are you gonna do now? Okay, so both of your sides lost people, your sons and daughter. So he's like, okay, you're gonna have to pay for this somehow. But then Friar's like, oh wait, this is gonna end the feud. So basically, overall, the way Friar wanted this to happen didn't really carry out exactly how it wanted to. But then eventually the feud ended. So at the end of the story, Capulet and Montague, so the Capulets decide to build a golden statue of Romeo, and then Montague says, okay, we'll build a golden statue of Juliet then. And that's basically how the feud ends. There's no actual end to the feud, but that's pretty peaceful enough. Now, there's a lot of plot in this story, and it's really a lot better if you just read it yourself and kind of go through it yourself, rather than me explaining to you one by one who dies, what happens. That kind of ruins the build up, the suspense of the story. So I'm going to tell you the themes and then the kind of important parts. So we wrote an essay in class about, of course, who is responsible for Romeo and Juliet's death. So I was actually, unlike my other friends who were Friar, I was deciding between Friar and the feud and fate, because the prompt was who is to blame, but who can be anyone. If you think about it, you can make a who or what or where or when. And honestly, fate is kind of a cause of their deaths, because at the beginning it says star-crossed lovers, which means they're bound by fate. No matter what happens, rather he didn't go to the party, they would have met somehow. They would have died somehow, because they're both he's a Montague and she's a Capulet, and that's not going to change. That's just their fate. And then the food is also a big cause, which is because like that's the only reason why Romeo and Juliet couldn't like get publicly married, and that's why Juliet was forced to marry Paris, and she's like, okay, I'm not gonna marry Paris, so I'm gonna take this drug instead and pretend I'm dead, and then Romeo goes find her. So all this wouldn't happen if it wasn't for the feud, if it wasn't for fate, and if it wasn't for Friar. Now I can't say this with like 100% guarantee, maybe like a 99.9% guarantee, but this is Shakespeare's play, and maybe he doesn't think that anyone is to blame. Maybe he's just like, it's everyone's fault. It's no one's fault. Maybe it's just like human nature's fault. All this vengeance with Romeo killing him and Tybalt killing him, and then all this like vengeance and this feud and this tension, maybe that's just the cause of everything. Like no one is to actually blame. But we don't know because unfortunately Shakespeare is dead. Shakespeare has passed away. And I honestly think that this book is really good, and not just because it's like, not only because it's kind of like a childhood experience for me. Like ever since I was little, I heard about this Romeo and Juliet. I'm just like, who is this? And the first thing I was exposed to was Romeo and Juliet, and that's so cute. They're like little gnomes, and it's like, and then it's like basically it's two households, basically both alike in dignity, but they're actually households. They're like two houses, and then they own a bunch of gnomes, and then like there's a, instead of Romeo, there's Nomeo, and then Juliet is just Juliet, which is kind of just lame. They should have made like Nuliet, something like that. Anyways, that's really cute. You should watch that, Romeo and Juliet. Good. And that was my first exposure, and that was probably when I was really, really little, probably before I entered middle school, probably around that time. And ever since then, I'm just like, oh, I want to read this Romeo and Juliet. So I found this book not like before high school. I'm just like, hey, okay, I'm gonna read this. I opened it, I'm just like, nope, way too hard. There are way too many words I don't know, and like I don't even know how to like pronounce Balthazar and Benvolio. So I'm just like, okay, I'm gonna pick this up later. And then fortunately we read it, and I think it was really good because it demonstrates a lot of themes like friendship, family, love, fate, a lot of these themes that are actually really important in real life. And I feel like this connects more to the actual world than other fictional books, because this is about love, and like it's not, I wouldn't say it's like more or less realistic, but I feel like this is more likely to happen since there was like a remake of it with like Frozen, and I'm pretty sure like a lot of K-dramas are like that. Like there's just a lot of influence from like, I feel like originally Shakespeare's idea. And so I would highly suggest to read this book if you haven't already, and if you have, then reread it because I think it's a great novel for both youngsters, for youth, and for the elderly.